In this video, we're going to explore some basic workflow ideas in RStudio. Thus far, we've played around with the console, and we've learned that it's basically good for just playing around, right? We can go to this console in the bottom left. We can use it as a calculator. We can apply built-in functions. We can do things like store results for later. So maybe I want to define x to be the number 25 and define y to be the number 6. And then maybe I want to define z to be the sum of x and y, which here is 31. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time in the console because it has some major weaknesses. Mainly, it's bad for recording, updating, and reproducing our work. So if I want to record an analysis, say my XYZ analysis here, I can't easily store this in the console and use it for later. So I would have to do something like copy and paste from the console into a separate application, maybe a Google Doc or a Word doc. That's both tedious, going back and forth between different applications, and it leaves me open to making a bunch of errors, right? There's a lot of errors that can happen when I'm copying and pasting. It's also very difficult to update an analysis from within the console. So for example, when I come back later, maybe I want to change the number 25 to 30, and I want to change y from 6 to 10. Now I can't just highlight the numbers in my console and replace 25 with 30, for example. I have to retype everything. So I would have to redefine x as 30, redefine y as 10, and not only that, I would have to come back and redefine z. I wanted z to be the sum of x and y, but it's not, right? It's the sum of the old x and y. So I have to also update z to be the sum of the new x and y, which is 40. Now this is, again, just tedious, and there are a lot of places along the way where I might make a mistake here. Now finally, the console is not good for reproducibility. So at the end of an analysis, I want to have a file or a set of files that from those files I can run them and get back exactly what I got before. That seems like a basic thing, but it's really challenging in the console. I also want to be able to take my file or set of files, hand them to someone else, and for them to be able to get exactly what I got. Right? That's not easy to do and is pretty impossible to do with the console. So our workflow is going to involve quarto documents. If you're familiar with R Markdown, it's very, very similar. So the first step is to open a new quarto document. To that end, I'll go up to the top menu in RStudio, go to File, New File, Quarto Document. So File, New File, Quarto Document. Don't get distracted by all the other types of files that we could open here. So I'm going to open a quarto document. I get a pop-up that basically asks what I want to title it, the structure I want. I'm just going to click the Create button at the bottom of that pop-up, and then I'll fix the file inside the file itself. All right, so what I get might be different than what you get. I get something that looks blank, but is not. So I'm going to do two things. In the top right of my quarto document that I just created, there's a set of horizontal lines. I'm going to click that button, and that will hide the document outline. So basically, there's this kind of blank outline that's hiding the body of the file. I'm also going to go to the top left corner of my quarto document and click Source to say that I want to work from the source, not through a visual editor. Now what I have should be similar to what you would get if you took the same steps, though the details might be slightly different depending upon what R version you're working with. Now before digging into the file, let's save it. To that end, I'll go back to the File tab in that top menu and Save As. Now you can save it wherever you want on your machine. Well, not the downloads. Definitely save it either in your documents or desktop. Here I've created a folder named Demo that exists on my computer in my documents. And in that folder, I'm going to put my notes file. So I'll name it Notes. It has a QMD extension. So this is a quarto document, a QMD file. and I will save. Notice when I save, now it's called notes.qmd at the top left here. And in the bottom right tab or pane of RStudio in my Files tab, now I observe my notes.qmd file. So it's in my demo folder, and it's a file called notes.qmd. Now, just for the purpose of this video, I'm going to delete everything from line 6 on down and just leave the top 5 lines here. Now, these top lines, we call them the YAML, yet another markdown language. It basically just sets up the structure of my document. The first piece here is the title, so I'm going to call this Quarto Notes. Now notice that this Quarto document is dynamic. I can type in it, and I can change things. Now, but it also looks a little goofy and maybe different than you would expect for, a word processor or something like a word processor. So what we're going to do often is click this render button. So it's at the top of the Quarto document. It has a right-facing blue arrow and says render. So I'll click that document. And for me, in my viewer tab in the bottom right, up pops another file. For you, it might pop up in a separate pop-up window, and that's fine. So whereas my Quarto document is dynamic, I can type in it, this file over here is static, right? I can't type in it as much as I want to try. I can't change anything. So this file is an HTML file, and it was rendered or basically defined by the contents of my QMD file. And it's a completely separate file. So when I go back to my Files tab, notice I have my notes.qmd, and next to it now, in the same folder, is a notes.html file. That HTML file is what we have in the viewer here. Now it's pretty blank, it just has a title, and I can do things that I would do in a different kind of word processor, right? I can type text. So this is, whoops, I have my caps on. So this is my first Quarto doc. And notice nothing changes over in the HTML. If I want to create that change in the HTML, I have to render again my QMD. And now my text pops up over there. Now I can do other things to text that I would do in, again, like a Google Doc or Word doc, such as italicize and bold different font or bold different words. So I could say this is my first Quarto doc. So if I put asterisks around a word or set of words and I render, notice that it's italicized that word. If I want to bold a word, I can put double asterisks around it. And so if I render that, it appears as bold in my HTML. And just as I might in a different, like a Google Doc, for example, I can have section and subsection headers, mainly different signposts that help structure my document. So I might have a section called Notes and a section called R code. And to make those section headers, I use the pound sign. So if I'm in kind of this kind of just regular text area and I have a pound sign and a word next to it, right, that creates headers or subsection headers. So if I do 2 pound signs instead of 1, or I'll do 3 pound signs, it'll be visually more apparent when I render. It creates subsections. So each pound sign represents a section. Each additional pound sign is a subsection or a subsection of that. So I'm just going to go back to having 2 sections, notes and R code. Now, of course, what we're doing in RStudio is using code a lot, right? We want to be able to analyze data and store our results, or just do other type of processing, not just working with data. So if I want to do R code, so for example, before I had things like I could do calculations. Now notice when I render my document, 2 plus 3 just shows up as text, right? I don't get a result of 5. So if I want to distinguish my discussion or text from code, I need to put the code inside what we call an R chunk. An R chunk starts by 3 backslashes or ticks, back ticks, curly brackets with an R inside, R meaning this is an R code chunk, and then I close my chunk with 3 backticks. And now if I type below that, outside my chunk, that's again going to be text. So when I render the document, notice that this 2 plus 3, because I put it inside an R chunk, when I rendered, that chunk was evaluated or was processed. So I have 2 plus 3, what I wrote, and the result of 5. Above that, I have regular text, and below that, I have regular text. But I've distinguished here that this is R code by putting it in a chunk. Now, I can either type out the pieces of the chunk, or if I want to take a small shortcut, I can insert an R chunk by at the top of my QMD, there's a green button with the letter C and a plus sign on it. And I can press that and say insert an R chunk. These other options are for other languages, right? And that inserts an R chunk. Now notice in the R chunk, right, I have my code. I also have some buttons on the upper right-hand side. So this green arrow button, the one at the furthest right, will run it inside my QMD. So sometimes if I'm just playing around and I don't want to render my document after every R chunk or after every line in an R chunk, I can just test it out in my QMD with this green arrow. I can also have multiple lines in a chunk, right? So suppose I want to add 2 and 3, and then I want to calculate 5 squared. So again, trying it out in my QMD, 2 plus 3 is 5, 5 squared is 25, and if I render the document, right, both of those now will be evaluated. 2 plus 3 is 5, and 5 squared is 25. Right, there are a lot of other things that we can add into a Quarto document besides just text and code, right? I can add videos, I can add images, I can have hyperlinks, I can have mathematical typesetting, so similar to LaTeX if you're familiar with LaTeX. But these are the basics. So one last thing that I want to talk about is some common mistakes. So recall earlier that we had defined x to be 30. And so suppose I want to work with that x value inside my Quarto document. Now, if I run this chunk inside my Quarto document, it pops up x is 30. Because this Quarto document, when I'm just playing around with it, is communicating with the console. However, if I render my document, notice that I get an error. It says object X not found, and that's a very common type of error. And it's pretty straightforward to fix. It means basically you have not defined X. So an important thing about Quarto is that when I go to render from Quarto to HTML, the only information that's being used in that process is information that I've put inside my Quarto document. So when I render, that rendering is not communicating with the console. So I have to define in my Quarto document everything that I need to run the analysis in that document. So if I want to define x as 30, right, I have to say so. So I have to define that x inside my document, and now that I've done that, I get correct results. All right, so these are the basics, right? We can use Quarto documents to do everything basically that the console is bad at. So Quarto documents are going to be great for recording, updating, and reproducing our work. So in terms of updating, just think now it's pretty easy. If I want to change x from 30 back to 26, I can just go in and edit that number, and everything will be updated accordingly. So suppose, just for example, I go back to 30. So x is 30, x plus 3 is 33. If I want to change x to 26 and I render, notice that I just have to change that one number and everything else is updated accordingly. X is 26, x plus 3 is 29. I don't have to go back and redefine everything as I had to do in the console at the beginning of this video. So I can record what I've done, so I can record discussion, record code, I can update that code easily, and I'm able to reproduce exactly what I did. So some tips as you're getting started. It's important to keep your files organized. Mainly, it's important to know where you're saving your QMD, what you've saved it as, and if I know that, then I can find the rendered HTML right next to it. Another pro tip is to render often. So if you're going through and creating a really long Quarto document with a bunch of code, and then at the end of that process you render, you're probably going to have an error somewhere in there that just happens when we're writing a lot of lines of code, and it's going to be easier to find that error if you render often. So mainly if you're if you narrow down the search for where the error could be happening. And then finally, remember that when rendering, a QMD does not communicate with the console. So every object, package, or anything that you need for an analysis in your QMD must be defined or loaded inside that QMD.